The Texas dusk bled across the horizon like a spilled bottle of Merlot, staining the sky in bruised violets and burning gold. Heat still shimmered off the hardpan ground, but a cooling wind carried the smell of oil and dust from the flight line, a scent as sharp and alive as gunpowder. Jacqueline Cochran stood at the edge of the airstrip with her hands tucked into the pockets of her khaki trousers, her profile dark against the molten sky. Behind her, the women lined up, helmet straps snapping shut, goggles glinting like tiny moons. They looked like statues at first glance, still alert, but their boots shifted on the packed earth, restless, as if the sky itself were tugging at them. The first engine coughed to life, then another, and another, until the field throbbed with the pulsing roar of machines that seemed half-wild and impatient to leap. A knot of German prisoners leaned against the barbed wire fence not far away, their uniforms dusty, their postures languid in the way of men who have learned to be bored for survival. But when the first woman strode past, tall, sun-browned, her parachute pack squared on her back, something sharpened in their faces. One of them muttered under his breath, and the others laughed, not cruelly but incredulously, as if they'd just seen a farmer teach a horse to waltz. Jacqueline noticed them and allowed herself the faintest smile. Let them stare. Let them puzzle. This was why she had fought for this program, why she had sparred with generals and written endless letters, why she had worn her nerves down to the quick, because this moment was more than a flight schedule. It was a revolution played out in propeller wash and desert wind. She walked the line, her boots kicking up small clouds, inspecting her pilots like a commander before a charge. Most were barely out of college, though the war had aged them with its relentless urgency. They were different from the wide-eyed girls who had arrived months ago, dragging suitcases and dreams across the country. These women carried themselves like steel rods wrapped in linen. They had lost the slouch of doubt. They belonged here now. At the far end of the row, a pilot named Frankie Moss adjusted her flight cap and caught Jacqueline's eye. She was slight, freckled, with a grin that came too easily for Jacqueline's taste, but she could fly a BT-13 through crosswinds that made other cadets weep. Jacqueline gave her a curt nod, and Frankie grinned wider, her teeth flashing. "Smooth landings tonight," she called over the rising roar. "Smooth everything," Jacqueline said, though her stomach was tight. Each flight was a gamble. Engines failed. Weather shifted. Men on the ground sometimes mistook the tow targets for the real thing. But she could not show fear. Leadership was theater, and the audience tonight was not just her pilots but the enemy watching from behind that wire. One by one, the planes taxied into position, kicking up spirals of dust that glowed like halos in the last light. The women climbed aboard with quick, practiced movements, and Jacqueline felt a pride that was almost physical, like something pressing against her ribs. These were not society ladies dabbling in adventure. They were pilots. They had endured blistered feet and emergency landings, long hours of classroom work, and the quiet cruelty of those who said they were taking men's jobs. And still they stood here, strapping themselves into the machines that could kill them as easily as they could carry them. The first plane lifted off, wheels barely clearing the earth before it clawed for altitude. The next followed, then the next, until the sky held a whole chain of rising silhouettes, each one banking into the sunset like a bead of onyx on a necklace. The sound of engines became a single muscular chord that filled the night air, and the German prisoners fell silent. Some crossed their arms, some scowled, but a few could not help but watch with open curiosity, their heads tilted as though trying to memorize this impossible scene for later retelling. Jacqueline stood rooted as the planes dwindled to specks. The field was suddenly quieter, only the sigh of wind through the grass and the distant clink of tools from the maintenance hangar. She allowed herself a breath, then another. The hardest part was the waiting. She thought of the women's families scattered across the country, mothers who wrote anxious letters, fathers who bragged and then confessed their worry when no one was listening. The country had asked its daughters to do what had once been unthinkable, and now it watched to see if they would succeed or fail. Footsteps approached from behind, and one of the ground crewmen stopped beside her, his cap in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "weather's holding good to the north. They should make it back easy." "Good," she replied, though she did not relax. She had learned long ago that a clear sky could turn treacherous in minutes. The prisoners were still at the fence. One of them, a young man with sharp cheekbones, caught her gaze and held it for a moment. His expression was unreadable. Was it mockery? Admiration? She couldn't tell. She only knew that his stare was heavy with history, with the weight of a Europe in flames, with the knowledge that if not for this wire between them, they would be enemies. The sun sank lower, a last smear of gold before the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. Soon the women would return, their landing lights winking like fireflies over the flatland, and she would count them, heart-thudding, until every last one was safe on the ground. But not all of them would come home every time. Jacqueline knew that too well. 38 had already been lost since the program's birth. She carried their names like a rosary, repeating them silently when the nights grew too long. Each mission was a vow renewed, a promise that their deaths would not be for nothing, that the program would endure until the war was won. Somewhere overhead, faint at first but growing stronger, came the sound of an engine. Jacqueline's head snapped up. There, just over the horizon, a single plane appeared, dipping its wings in the customary signal. Relief slid through her chest, warm as whiskey. The others would follow soon, strung out in the sky like beads returning to their string. She glanced once more at the prisoners. The young man still watched, his face pale in the twilight. For a moment, Jacqueline wondered what he would tell his comrades in the barracks tonight. Perhaps he would scoff, perhaps he would laugh, but she had seen the way his eyes widened when the planes lifted, had seen the crack form in his composure. Jacqueline turned toward the runway, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The night was far from over, and the war was far from won. But tonight, for these few hours, the sky belonged to them. And as the next plane's lights cut across the darkness, she felt the strange, steady certainty that something larger than any of them was taking shape here, something that neither barbed wire nor history could contain. The war did not politely knock before entering America's living rooms. It crashed through them with newspaper headlines and telegrams that turned breakfast tables into altars of dread. By 1942, the military's demand for pilots had become a bottomless well, draining flight schools of men and leaving the home front with empty cockpits and ferry routes piling up with unflown aircraft. Bombers and fighters sat like restless beasts at factories, gleaming, waiting to be delivered. But every hour they sat was an hour stolen from the war effort overseas. The solution, at first glance, seemed unthinkable. At least, unthinkable to men in starched uniforms who had built their careers on the belief that war was the work of men alone. Into that storm stepped Jacqueline Cochran, the woman whose very life had been a dare to the impossible. She had clawed her way out of a childhood of poverty, selling beauty products door to door, before she ever touched an airplane's yoke. She became one of the most celebrated female pilots of the pre-war years, a speed record holder, a fixture of air races, her name etched into trophies and newspapers. But ambition was never enough for her. She wanted purpose, a cause larger than the next race. And in the crucible of war, she found it. She wrote to General Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces, proposing a corps of women trained to fly military aircraft for domestic, non-combat missions. It was a simple, pragmatic argument. Let women handle the ferrying, the target towing, the test flights, everything that didn't involve dogfighting Messerschmitts, so that male pilots could be freed for combat. Arnold was skeptical but intrigued. It was Eleanor Roosevelt who tipped the scales, penning her own support for the idea in her newspaper column and urging America to rethink who was allowed to serve. Thus began an experiment as audacious as it was fragile. Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, became the proving ground. When the first class arrived, they found not a polished military base but a dusty outpost where scorpions nested under bunks and the Texas wind howled like a banshee through the cracks in the barracks. There was nothing romantic about it. Days began before sunrise with calisthenics, drills, ground school lectures, and flight practice. The women sweated in coveralls, marched until their feet blistered, learned Morse code and navigation, and climbed into cockpits that smelled of fuel and leather. At night, lying on thin mattresses, they listened to the engines whining far out on the flight line, a sound that seemed to burrow under their skin. Some wrote letters home insisting they were fine, others cried quietly into their pillows, but all of them woke before dawn and did it again. There was no room for weakness here. Fail the flight check twice and you were gone. Washouts packed their bags in silence, leaving the field before breakfast, their dreams abandoned like ghost planes on the tarmac. Jacqueline visited frequently, sweeping across the base like a storm front, her hair perfectly set, her voice sharp enough to cut through the roar of engines. She pushed her women hard, demanding they not only meet the men's standards but exceed them. She had no patience for excuses. To the instructors, she said, "Train them as you would train your best cadets. Better if you can." They will have to prove themselves every day. And prove themselves they did. Frankie Moss, the freckled pilot with the easy grin, earned a reputation for precision landings so smooth the tires barely kissed the ground. Ruth Daly, a farmer's daughter from Iowa, could strip and reassemble a propeller assembly faster than some of the mechanics. Each small triumph felt like a victory not just over the syllabus, but over centuries of expectation that said women's hands belonged in kitchens, not on control sticks. Still, resistance clung to them like burrs. Local townsfolk sometimes gawked or whispered when they saw the women marching through Sweetwater in formation. Newspaper editorials sniffed about petticoat pilots, taking up resources better spent on men. Some male instructors resented the assignment, convinced that the program was a publicity stunt destined for disaster. The women heard the doubts but pressed on, their determination hardening with every insult. The conflict was never just about flying. It was about legitimacy. These women were not members of the military. They were classified as civilians, paid less than their male counterparts, given no insurance or death benefits. If they crashed and burned, the War Department washed its hands of them. That knowledge sat in the back of every pilot's mind like a ticking clock, but it also bound them together. They shared jokes, cigarettes, and the kind of bone-deep fatigue that turned strangers into sisters. One scorching afternoon, after a string of successful solo flights, Jacqueline gathered the latest class near the hangar. The smell of hot oil and dust hung in the air, and the sun threw long, hard shadows across the ground. She looked over the faces turned toward her. Faces flushed with pride, faces that had tasted fear and survived it. "You are doing something this country has never seen before," she told them, her voice carrying over the rattle of an engine test. "Every mile you fly is a mile that proves the world wrong about you." The words settled over the group like a blessing, but Jacqueline felt the weight of what lay ahead. The program was still under scrutiny, its funding fragile, its existence dependent on proving absolute worth. One accident too many, one political misstep, and it could all vanish overnight. She could not afford to falter, not now. As dusk fell, the women stood on the flight line, watching the last plane of the day taxi in. Its propeller slowed, then stopped, leaving a ringing silence. The instructor climbed out, gave the pilot a brisk nod, and walked away. The woman pulled off her helmet and let the wind sweep through her hair, her face shining with sweat and triumph. For a moment, everything felt possible. In the distance, a train whistle moaned, lonely and far off, carrying the reminder that the world beyond this field was still burning, still demanding more of them. Tomorrow there would be more flights, more tests, more chances to prove that women could shoulder this burden as well as any man. The night insects began to sing, the Texas stars ignited overhead, and Jacqueline turned toward the hangars with her jaw set. Somewhere deep inside, a storm was gathering, the kind that would either carry them forward or tear the program apart. And as the first coyotes howled on the far hills, she could not shake the feeling that the real test had not even begun. The first time Frankie Moss flew a target-towing mission, her throat went dry at the sight of the gun barrels waiting for her on the ground. The gunnery crews stood ready with their .50 caliber weapons, the sun glinting off the polished metal. Her job was simple on paper. Keep the plane steady while the fabric target trailed behind, giving the crews a moving bullseye to practice on. But there was nothing simple about hearing the staccato rip of gunfire while she flew straight and level, trusting that every man below had the discipline to keep the tracers from cutting her out of the sky. The tow cable rattled behind her like a snake, the target flapping and snapping in the slipstream. Sweat pooled under her goggles. Somewhere below, the first burst erupted, a string of glowing beads that stitched the air frighteningly close. She held her line, jaw locked, until the run was complete. When she landed, her hands trembled so hard she had to sit on them before climbing out of the cockpit. Jacqueline watched from the flight line, her face unreadable except for the faintest nod. That was all the praise Frankie would get, but it was enough. These missions became the crucible in which the women were forged. They were not merely ferry pilots now. They were essential to training the men who would fly into combat. Every day brought new challenges, flying bombers that had just rolled off the factory line and might still hide dangerous flaws, ferrying fighter planes cross-country through storms that came out of nowhere, testing experimental aircraft whose quirks were still being discovered. When something went wrong, it was the WASP in the cockpit who paid the price. One sweltering afternoon, a gear malfunction sent AP-39 spinning off the runway, its nose crumpling like paper. The pilot, Sarah Bird, was killed instantly. There were no military honors, no folded flag handed to her family. The women passed the hat to pay for her body to be sent home. That night in the barracks, they sat in silence, the air thick with grief and something darker. The realization that the world would not mourn them as it mourned its sons. Their deaths were private tragedies, easily forgotten. The next morning, they were back on the line. That was Jacqueline's way. No time for sentiment when the schedule demanded planes be moved, missions be flown. She grieved too, though she rarely let it show. Each loss burned her like a brand, making her more determined to prove that the program was worth every risk. The Germans behind the fence seemed to watch more closely as the months went on. Word had spread among them that these women flew not only trainers but fighters and bombers too. They gathered at the edge of the wire when a B-17 taxied out, its massive engines shaking the ground. 2 WASPs climbed aboard with the easy confidence of veterans, their parachutes slung like knapsacks. One of the prisoners spat on the ground and turned away, but another kept watching, his brow furrowed as if trying to solve a puzzle. It was a strange kind of theater. This war in miniature played out under the West Texas sun. The women felt the weight of the unseen audience beyond the wire, just as they felt the skeptical gaze of the men on base who still doubted their competence. But the more they were watched, the more determined they became to fly perfectly, to give no one an excuse to call them amateurs. Sometimes they laughed in the face of danger, their humor a kind of armor. One evening after a particularly hair-raising cross-country ferry flight, Frankie joked that she had spent more time praying than flying. "At least you were efficient," Ruth Daly quipped, hanging her flight suit on its peg. "You logged air hours and spiritual ones." The barracks erupted with tired, grateful laughter. But the dangers were constant. Mechanical failures, sudden downdrafts, engines that coughed and quit miles from a landing strip. Every flight was a roll of the dice. One stormy day, lightning split the sky while Frankie ferried a P-47 Thunderbolt across Oklahoma. The cockpit lit up like a flashbulb, the controls jerking in her hands. She gritted her teeth, flying blind through sheets of rain, trusting the instruments, every nerve taut until the clouds broke and the field came into view. When she taxied in, drenched and shivering, Jacqueline was waiting. "Good work," she said simply, her tone softer than usual. Frankie felt the compliment like a metal pin to her chest. The program's successes began to ripple outward. Reports from the front praised the efficiency of plane deliveries, the reliability of the women's work. Still, the pressure mounted. The more they proved themselves, the more dangerous assignments they were given. Dora Doherty and Dorothea Mormon were chosen to fly the new B-29 Superfortress after male pilots complained the plane was too unstable. The 2 women mastered it in days, then flew a demonstration that silenced the critics. When they landed, sweat streaked their faces but their eyes gleamed. They had not only flown the beast, they had tamed it. By late 1944, the WASPs had logged millions of miles and ferried thousands of aircraft. They had become indispensable, and yet they were still treated as temporary labor, a solution to be discarded once the war's hunger eased. Jacqueline could feel the shift in the wind. The war was turning in the Allies' favor, and soon there would be more male pilots than missions. She knew what that meant for her women. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hangars, Jacqueline walked the quiet flight line alone. The air was heavy with the smell of avgas and dust, and somewhere a radio played a mournful tune about soldiers coming home. She thought of the faces of those who would never come home, Sarah Bird and the others, and wondered if history would remember them at all. A spotlight from the guard tower swept across the fence, catching the faces of the POWs who had gathered again to watch the last flight of the day. Their silhouettes glowed for a moment before the light moved on, leaving them in shadow. Jacqueline's gaze followed the beam toward the darkening sky, where the final plane circled for landing. The engine note was steady, but her stomach clenched all the same. Every landing was a prayer answered, every safe return a small miracle. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling to a stop with a hiss of brakes. The pilot climbed down, pulling off her helmet, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. For a heartbeat, everything seemed suspended. The day's heat, the war's weight, the endless waiting. Then somewhere in the distance came the rumble of another engine, not from the field but far beyond it, a sound that did not belong to the scheduled flights. Jacqueline turned toward the horizon, her pulse quickening. Whatever was coming next would test them in ways they had not yet imagined, and she knew with cold certainty that the sky's demands were far from finished. By the summer of 1944, The numbers told a story that even the most skeptical generals could not ignore. More than 25,000 women had applied for the program since its inception, but only 1,074 had survived the winnowing process to earn their silver wings. Together they had flown over 60 million miles. Miles of ferry routes, of training loops, of bomber runs and fighter deliveries. They had delivered over 12,000 aircraft of 78 different types, everything from the docile PT-19 trainers to the muscular B-17 Flying Fortress. Each mile was a line in a ledger that could not be denied, proof that women could shoulder this part of the war as competently as any man. And yet, for all the statistics that piled up like ammunition crates, recognition remained elusive. Frankie Moss carried the numbers in her head like charms against doubt. She could recite them on cue when questioned by reporters or curious soldiers who still asked if she was afraid to fly. 60 million miles, she would say, grinning as though daring them to challenge her. If fear were going to stop us, it would have stopped us at mile 1. Her bravado was partly theater, but also partly survival. Humor kept the shadows at bay. The women had a knack for turning danger into punchlines. One morning, after a training flight ended in a wheels-up landing that scattered dust for half a mile, the pilot walked into the mess hall still brushing dirt from her hair and announced, "Good news, ladies. We've discovered a new runway. It's made entirely of field." The barracks erupted with laughter, the sound high and bright against the backdrop of war. Humor was their pressure valve, a way to let out the fear that otherwise might have strangled them. Jacqueline understood this need, though she rarely participated in the jokes. Her own wit was dry, biting when she used it. "If you're going to crash," she once told a class after a rash of rough landings, "do it with enough style that the newspapers can at least make you look heroic." The women laughed nervously, but they also heard the truth beneath the jest. Every accident was ammunition for critics who wanted the program shut down. Recognition was slow in coming, but there were moments when pride swelled like a well-tuned engine. Instructors who had once dismissed the women grudgingly admitted their skill. Letters arrived from combat zones thanking the WASPs for delivering planes on time, sometimes ahead of schedule, planes that went on to fly missions over Europe or the Pacific. Each letter was read aloud in the barracks like a benediction. But pride could not fully erase the sting of being considered expendable. When a WASP was killed, the military offered no flag, no escort, no benefits to the family left behind. The women took up collections for flowers, for train tickets to send the bodies home. At funerals, they stood in their khaki uniforms, heads bowed, forming the honor guard that the government would not provide. In those moments, the war's cost felt personal and bitter. Frankie attended too many of those farewells. She remembered the weight of silence after the bugler finished, the smell of dust and carnations mixing in the hot air. She remembered standing so still that her knees ached, determined not to cry until the casket was gone from sight. Later, in the quiet of the barracks, she and Ruth Daly would sit on their bunks, trading stories of the dead woman's best landings, her worst jokes, her quirks that made them laugh. Keeping the memory alive was their own small rebellion against being erased. Still, there were flashes of lightness that no tragedy could fully smother. The women decorated the barracks with cartoons of themselves wrestling stubborn engines or outflying cocky male pilots. They gave their planes nicknames, painted lipstick marks on the noses of trainers, and took photographs of each other grinning from cockpits. These scraps of joy stitched the long months together, a reminder that life could still hold sweetness even in the shadow of war. Jacqueline kept meticulous records of every achievement, every hour flown, every delivery made. She knew they were more than statistics. They were ammunition in a different kind of battle, the fight to ensure that women's contributions would not be dismissed when the war ended. In her private moments, she wrote letters to Washington, lobbying for military status for her pilots, reminding the brass that these women had risked their lives for their country. Some letters went unanswered. Some were politely declined. But she kept writing. By autumn, rumors began to circulate that the program might be shut down. Male pilots were returning from overseas, their combat tours finished, and they wanted flying jobs. There were whispers in the mess hall, anxious glances traded across the parade ground. The women kept flying, but the air seemed heavier, charged with the knowledge that their time might be running out. One evening, after a long day of deliveries, Frankie stood outside the barracks watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. The sky was streaked with crimson, the wind carrying the faint smell of fuel and mesquite. Ruth came to stand beside her, hands in her pockets. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked quietly. Frankie shrugged, her throat tight. Next is tomorrow's flight. After that, we'll see. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The first stars appeared, cold and sharp above the darkening field. Somewhere a radio played a Johnny tune, the kind meant to make people forget there was a war on. Frankie smiled faintly, thinking of all the miles they had flown, all the times they had tempted fate and won. Whatever came next, no one could take those miles away from them. Then, faint at first but growing clearer, came the sound of engines overhead. More than one, the throaty roar of fighters returning late from a cross-country hop. The women looked up, shielding their eyes, until the planes came into view, sleek silhouettes against the last light. The sight sent a thrill through Frankie, a reminder of why she had come here in the first place. The planes dipped their wings in salute before lining up for landing. As the first touched down, the air vibrated with the thrum of power. Ruth glanced at Frankie and grinned, her earlier worry momentarily forgotten. For this moment, at least, the sky still belonged to them. But as Jacqueline watched from the edge of the field, her expression was grim. She held a telegram in her hand, its words stark and final. The program's funding was in jeopardy. In the distance, the last plane rolled to a stop, its engine winding down. The sudden silence seemed to echo forever, and Jacqueline knew that the fight for the program's survival had just entered its most perilous phase. The telegram lay on Jacqueline's desk like a coiled snake. She read it again, as though the words might shift if she stared hard enough, but they remained as merciless as a midwinter wind. Funding withdrawn, program to be dissolved. The war's tide had turned, the need for women pilots, so urgent only a year before, was suddenly deemed unnecessary. Men were coming home from combat, ready to reclaim the cockpits, and Washington wanted the women gone before the year was out. She rose, her chair scraping the floor, and crossed to the window. Outside, the wind whipped across the field, scattering dust like restless ghosts. Beyond the fence, the German prisoners were drilling, their boots thudding in unison. She felt their presence like a mirror, a reminder that the world was still at war even as her own battle was about to be lost. The women took the news in silence at first. When Jacqueline stood before them in the hangar that evening, her voice was steady, clipped, but her eyes betrayed the steel beneath. "The program ends in December," she said. "You will finish your final assignments. You will fly as though the eyes of the world are on you. Because they are." Frankie Moss stood in the crowd, her fists jammed in her pockets. The words hit her like a downdraft. For months, she had flown through storms, through target practice, through mechanical failures that could have killed her. She had believed that each mile was a stone paving the road for women who would come after. And now it seemed that road would end in the dust just outside the hangar door. That night, the barracks buzzed with frustration. Ruth Daly sat on the edge of her bunk, polishing her boots with a vigor that made the leather squeak. "They'll write us out of the history books," she said flatly. "Like we never even flew. Then we won't give them the satisfaction," Frankie said, her voice hard. "We'll finish strong. Make them remember us." The next weeks became a strange kind of vigil. Every mission carried a weight beyond its orders. When Frankie ferried a P-51 Mustang to a base in Louisiana, she flew with a precision so sharp it was almost surgical, greasing the landing so smoothly that the ground crew applauded. Ruth delivered a C-47 through a snowstorm and stepped down from the cockpit with frost crusting her lashes, grinning like a prizefighter who'd gone 12 rounds. Each safe flight was a quiet act of defiance. Jacqueline moved among them like a general in a losing campaign, her presence galvanizing even as the shadow of the end loomed larger. She wrote more letters, made more calls, but each day brought the same answer: no extension, no reconsideration. The government had made up its mind. December arrived sharp and cold. The last class graduated under a pale sky, their silver wings gleaming as they pinned them to their uniforms. There was pride, but also a hollow ache that no applause could fill. When the final day came, the women gathered on the flight line, standing shoulder to shoulder as if by sheer will they could hold the program together. Jacqueline climbed onto the wing of a trainer and faced them. Her voice carried over the empty field. "You have done everything asked of you, and more," she said. "You have flown every mile with skill, courage, and grace. Do not think for a moment that what you have done will be forgotten." Frankie felt the words settle deep inside her, a strange mix of pride and grief. She looked down the line at the faces of her friends, sunburned, oil-smudged, tired, and felt the weight of what they had built together. This was not just a unit. It was a sisterhood forged in sky and fire. The engines of a row of trainers fired up, one after another, their propellers slicing the cold air. For a moment, the field came alive again, the sound swelling until it seemed to vibrate in the bones. One by one, the planes rolled forward, lifting into the sky in a formation that climbed toward the winter sun. The women watched, their heads tilted back, as the aircraft carved white arcs against the blue. At the top of the climb, the planes turned and began to loop back, and as they passed over the field, one ship peeled away, climbing higher while the others continued on. It was the missing man formation, the oldest, simplest tribute in aviation, and it hit Frankie like a fist to the chest. Her throat tightened as she thought of Sarah Bird and all the others who had not lived to see this day. When the formation vanished into the distance, silence rolled back over the field. Some women wept openly, others stood rigid, but none moved. For a long moment, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Frankie squared her shoulders. She turned toward Ruth, who was blinking hard, and said softly, "We were here. They can't take that away." Jacqueline heard her and felt something ease inside her chest. That was the victory she had fought for. Not just miles flown or planes delivered, but this unshakable knowledge that they had claimed their place in the sky. As the women dispersed, the POWs stood at the fence, their faces solemn. One of them lifted a hand in a brief, almost reluctant salute before turning away. It was a small gesture, but it struck Jacqueline like a gong. Respect from the enemy. Perhaps the world had shifted more than anyone realized. That night, as darkness wrapped the field, Jacqueline walked alone beneath the stars. The hangars loomed like silent sentinels, the air heavy with the scent of fuel and memory. Above her, the sky stretched wide and black, pricked with cold fire. She thought of all the women who had risen into that sky, who had trusted it to carry them, who had dared to make it theirs. Somewhere far off, she heard the faint rumble of a departing plane, its engine notes steady and sure. She smiled just a little. The program might be ending, but the echo of what they had done would roll on, carried in the roar of every plane yet to come. The sky, once forbidden, was theirs now, and no one, not the government, not history, could put it back in its cage. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.